Fantasy books have changed my life, and that's no hyperbole. The world building, the magic systems, the character arcs, really something to behold. And I agree with a lot of those de facto top 10 lists of greatest fantasy books of all time. I wanted to do my list a little bit different in the terms of I wanted to talk about the books that have influenced me on a personal level, on a spiritual level, and also on a music career level. Now, reading fantasy in no small part led to the job I have now, which is writing music for film and TV, specializing in book adaptations. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about my top 10 fantasy books of all time. Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. I'm a composer and now also a booktuber. You can find my music in the Wheel of Time Season 2, His Dark Materials Season 3, and the official Brent Week's companion album for his series Lightbringer that came out last year. So I wanted to take this time to talk a little bit about the 10 fantasy books that influenced me the most in throughout my life and kind of influenced my music life, because really I discovered a couple of fantasy series and I started writing music in that vein, and that led to my job of working on the Wheel of Time and working on His Dark Materials. So really, it really came full circle for me, where the reading experience and the music experience started to converge. And that was one of the impetuses of making this channel in the first place, is I wanted to speak about those influences and also be able to approach both reading and the content that is focused around books from a slightly different vantage point than other booktubers. So that was kind of the whole impetus for this channel, impetus for a lot of the stuff I get to work on musically, and the things that have influenced me in my life. So I wanted to personally caveat this list and just kind of let you know, I agree with a lot of people's de facto top 10 lists of like, these are the absolute top 10 fantasy books of all time. I agree with a lot of them, but I also have some personal choices that are going to deviate from that list, from those lists, because those particular books that are on my list have had a personal influence. So I'm going to kind of talk about it from a personal vantage point, and then also talk about what makes those books so great. So that's the first caveat. The second caveat is that an author may be represented multiple times on this list, but I will only represent one book per series. So I'm not going to have like the first 4 books of the Stormlight Archive on here, for obvious reasons. I don't want to inflate the list with book series like that. So I'm going to pick one particular key book, and sometimes it's a non-obvious choice, not necessarily everybody's favorite, but my personal favorite that kind of opened me up to that wider world. I wanted to say an honorable mention, and the honorable mention for my list is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, the reason I chose The Hobbit is when I was younger, probably in 5th or 6th grade, I read The Hobbit for the first time. I was riveted from page 1, and it really made me think about fantasy as a genre. I'd never read really much fantasy. I think I'd read maybe a couple of C.S. Lewis books, the Narnia books, like Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Magician's Nephew, I think, but I didn't really think about fantasy as like, oh, that's an interesting genre I'd want to explore more. The Hobbit was the first time I kind of read something cover to cover that really made me go, oh, that sounds awesome. Like, I just loved the world building and the characters, and like I Gollum's story, like all of that stuff was just so riveting to me. Now, the reason why it's not in the top 10 is it's an honorable mention because it didn't necessarily make me go, I gotta go down the rabbit hole of fantasy, if that makes sense. There are other books on this list that really made me do that. So that's the reason why this is an honorable mention. So without further ado, let's dive into the top 10. I'm pulling up my list here so I can make sure I keep everything straight, because sometimes when you're excited and you're talking about something, or at least for me, sometimes I get my numbers mixed up. So I want to make sure I make this list proper for you all. But number 10 is going to be a very unusual pick, and that is Roald Dahl's The Witches. So the reason why I chose this is it is a fantasy book I read in around the time I read The Hobbit, so around 5th or 6th grade. It was the first book that I read that really blew my mind. It wasn't just like, wow, that was a great story, which is what I felt about reading The Hobbit. But it actually blew my mind. I had never thought, oh, witches could be portrayed in a completely different way than the, stereotypical, like, Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch of the West or whatever. Or was it East? I forget now. But yeah, so the typical witch that you think of with a pointy hat and riding on a broomstick kind of a thing. Roald Dahl really just completely usurped that convention of witches and created a completely different type of story. The world building and the way the witches try to take over the world and everything was just such an interesting, unique concept. So that is my number 10. That is specifically on something that had the most influence for me growing up and kind of satiated my love for fantasy. Now, is that the top 10 best book of all time de facto? Who could say, right? These lists are all subjective. This is just my personal take on it. So that is my number 10. So number 9 is a book I read much more recently. I read it during the pandemic, so I read it in 2020. I had started reading The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher, which is about a wizard that lives in Chicago, and it's a kind of investigative mystery that meets kind of this larger world building. It's kind of influenced by like, like 90s, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and that kind of stuff. And like, it's definitely a palate cleanser type of a series. So it's something that you read in between big fantasy books. So, I started reading that series and I read the first two books. I think it was like Stormfront was the first book and Full Moon was the second book. And I thought they were fun. They were very pulp fiction-y, kind of noir kind of stuff. But it didn't really feel like fantasy in the broader sense. It was only with the third book, Grave Peril, that I felt like his wider world of fantasy started to open up. Really, the lore of the vampires and things like that started to come to the fold. And you start to see, oh, wait, this is not just kind of a fun, goofy, urban fantasy kind of a tale with some pulp fiction kind of elements. It's actually becoming more of this epic, dark fantasy scope. And that book, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. And I really feel like none of the other books in the Dresden Files so far, I think I'm about to start book 8 as of this taping. So none of the other Dresden Files have quite matched up to the mind-blowing sense that Grave Peril made me feel, where it's like your mind physically feels open to the possibilities of what, this series could be. So that is my number 9 choice, Grave Peril, book 3 in the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. If you haven't read any of these, by the way, definitely check them out. I really think they're worth a read. Some of these book series, when you think about, the first book is not always the most representative of the series. So that's why I wanted to kind of show you some of the non-obvious choices and get you to check some of these out and say like, hey, if you felt a little lukewarm on the first couple books, at least wait till book 3 before you make your decision on whether to, stay with the series or quit. So that's just my personal thoughts there. So that was number 9. Number 8 was a book I read in, I think it was middle school or beginning of high school, and it was kind of when it first came out, and that is Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. So the first 3 Harry Potter books, I was riveted at that age, This was at a time when I think the 4th book was actually pretty new. So it was, it was this collective consciousness. It was in the zeitgeist, like everybody was lining up at the Barnes & Noble at midnight, at Borders bookstores at the time at midnight to read these as they were being released, stay up all night and like trade books with their family members and like, read these. So it was really a cultural touchstone when I was growing up. And, this book was no exception. This was kind of a turning point in the series for those of you who have not kept up with or read the Harry Potter series yet, or have just watched the movies. The 4th book was a turning point in the series because it became a little bit darker. There were way more stakes, You kind of meet the antagonist of the series, Voldemort, he who must not be named, for the first time in the flesh, And there are some real world stakes. There are character deaths. And you start to feel like, a lot of the people who were reading these books, they were coming of age as they were reading it. And it was interesting because as the people who were reading it, like myself, were coming of age, the characters in the book were coming of age as well in the series. So you really felt like you were along for the ride alongside them. And so those character deaths and things like that felt very real. It felt very visceral, and it felt like it affected you personally. I would pick that as my number 8, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Number 7 is another maybe non-obvious choice. But this is, I got into John Gwynne maybe a couple years ago. And I got into him from a recommendation from Mike from Mike's Book Reviews. And I read the first 2. I loved them. The first one maybe less so, but the second one was just like, got my love for his Faithful and the Fallen series, which is kind of a 4-book series. It's got a little bit of Norse fantasy. and Viking fantasy influences and things like that. Really fascinating stuff. If you haven't read it, it's very influenced by like George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. You know, it's kind of got that dark, gritty, grimy kind of fantasy. Fantastic stuff. And it's also very traditional fantasy, but it also talks about like the nature of prophecy and kind of like what if prophecy is not always reliable and what would that mean, you know, for the characters it affects. So really fascinating series. But the book I'm going to choose from this Faithful and the Fallen series is number 3, and that is Ruin. This one features one of my favorite animal companions in Storm. And Storm's relationship with the main character, Corbin, is just beautiful. I mean, it's just such a beautiful relationship. There's some high stakes in this book, and you get some kind of shocking revelations in it as well. You know, kind of John Gwynne goes into areas that you would not expect him to go to. It's a very dark book, and it was one of those books that, you know, you're reading as furiously as you can because John Gwynne's chapters are shorter, and so you really feel like you're reading this fast-paced novel, but it's actually a very deep world and kind of deep character exploration. So really great how he balances that, and I feel like he came into his own in this third entry. And so I just loved Ruin, and it was one of those things where I'd bought the 4-book set, right? And I had all 4 books out, and I finished the third one. I still remember what it felt like. I finished it like on a Saturday night, and I turned the last page, and I immediately picked up the 4th book to read because I was that enamored by it. And it really just was like, this is a solid fantasy series through and through. So if you haven't read Faithful and the Fallen, please check it out. I implore you to check it out. I think you would love it. Leaving all the links down below as well so you can check some of these out if you would like to. This is my number 7 pick. Number 6 is one I read just a few months ago, actually. Now, I have become a fan of Joe Abercrombie and his First Law universe, just like so many other people on BookTube, so many other people in our book community. And he is able to make you care about some of the most detestable characters. On paper, they just sound so terrible, and yet they have such morally gray areas that you really feel for them. There's a torturer who used to be tortured, and you feel like he asks himself, why do I do this? Sandan Glokta is the name of the character. One of the most compelling characters in all of literature, I think, let alone fantasy. So Joe Abercrombie knows how to write dark, disturbed material, but then have this kind of British humor that's a kind of acerbic, witty humor that's kind of juxtapositioned against it. And it's just a pleasure to read. Now, the book I'm going to choose from the First Law universe, I haven't finished them all, so this may change, you know, as time goes by. But as of 2024, this is my list. And the book I'm going to choose is a standalone called Best Served Cold. Now, this is the 4th entry in the First Law universe. It is the first standalone in the First Law universe, so it takes place after the trilogy, the First Law trilogy. And I absolutely loved Monza's character. When I first read it, you know, when I first read the back of the book, I heard it was kind of like a you know, classic revenge tale kind of a thing, Count of Monte Cristo type revenge tale. And I was like, okay, that's been done before. You know, I'm curious to see what Joe Abercrombie adds. And of course, he adds a lot of depth and a lot of character development in it. He kind of makes you explore the idea of, you know, it lives up to its name, Best Served Cold. Revenge is a dish best served cold, right? Like in the sense that, you know, even if you get what you want, is it really what you want ultimately? And he makes you feel that through Monza's plight and through the kind of developments that happen in that book as Monza kind of struggles to get revenge. So it's just a fantastic book through and through. It was like revelation after revelation as I was turning the pages, and it got to a point where I just couldn't stop reading it. I was like, drop everything I'm doing. I don't care. You know, I'll sleep a little less. I'll work a little harder next week, but I need to finish this. So this book had an indelible impression on me and kind of made me think of fantasy in a different way, in the sense that, like, things can be dark, things can be disturbed, but they don't have to be depressing, if that makes sense. I never feel like with the First Law world, it's bleak enough to feel nihilistic. And so it compels you to read because you care about these characters. Even if you hate them, even if you love to hate them, even if you hate to love them, you know, you care about them either way. So that is my number 6 pick, and that is Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie, the standalone in his First Law universe. Looking at my list here again, number 5 is a book I read, actually. My then girlfriend and now wife, Linda, when we first started dating, she mentioned this one particular book by Brandon Sanderson, and it's the Mistborn series. Now, the book that I started reading was Mistborn: The Final Empire, and that's the first book in that first trilogy. And that is going to be my number 5 pick. And the reason for that is I remember reading the kind of the, I forget if it was the prologue or if it was the first chapter, but I'm just reading the first couple of pages and I was instantly riveted, and there was no turning back for me after that. That was my entry to Brandon Sanderson's work, and after I read it, I just had to read everything of the Cosmere. So I just fell in love with the characters. I fell in love with Vin and Kelsier and like their relationship. It's kind of a heist fantasy, but then it works its way through a broader world. Like, what if the tyrant wins? And that's where the book starts, where the series starts. What happens then? What happens next? Even if you're able to defeat the people that you want to defeat, does that mean your problems are over? Like, all these different kind of questions are posed in that book. And I just love the way Brandon Sanderson weaves like this kind of heist fantasy with this epic fantasy, deep lore about the metals and the metal mines and how they influence like these main characters' powers and things like that. Really unique magic system. One of his most fleshed out and best magic systems, in my opinion. And I felt in Mistborn Era 1, he really explores this at length, and I felt it was the most compelling of the two eras, that he's released so far. And that book made me riveted through and through. So I would say my number 5 pick is the first book in the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson, and that is Mistborn: The Final Empire. Number 4, another book I read quite recently, actually. Last year, a filmmaker friend of mine and I decided to read a series together because we both love books and we've been, kind of wanting to explore more fantasy books. So we decided that we would check out, finally, A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin. And, I'd watched the Game of Thrones series and everything, and so I was a little trepidatious about reading these books because, I was like, I kind of know what happens already. I don't really want to read a rehash of that. You know what I'm saying? And then the second part is like, George R. R. Martin may never finish the series. Do I really want to start a series that I know is possibly never going to be finished? And so those were my two qualms. But I read the first book, A Game of Thrones, and I was like instantly riveted. I mean, from the prologue, I was set. George R. R. Martin, his character development is second to none, I think. And he really, like, his prose and his writing, it's like it drips off the page. It makes me salivate reading those books, both from the beauty of his writing, and then also the way he describes food, honestly. Every time he describes food, it's like, I would never eat that, but I kind of want to eat that because it sounds so delicious the way George R. R. Martin describes it. So anyways, I just fell in love with that series, and if I had to pick one book, I mean, it's so hard to pick because all of them are really, top tier, S tier books, every single one of them. But if I had to pick one that I feel like was like, this is the one, the cornerstone, the centerpiece of his writing, and I would say the heights of the series so far, that would be Book 3, A Storm of Swords. The Red Wedding, the moon door scene. Like, there are so many scenes in this that are iconic, They were iconic in the show. They're even more iconic in the book. I think, like, even knowing what happens, it didn't make my heart palpitate any less reading it on the page. And I thought that the Sansa's character development, Arya's character development, you see them evolve as people. You kind of start to see certain characters. I don't want to, like, spoil things, so I'm kind of trying to be very high level about this, but there's certain characters that you would have hated in the first two books, just absolutely detested, and they seem like irredeemable characters, and certain things start to change and you start to look at them in different lights. He makes you do that in a way that I've never seen anyone do, like anyone in any other series. So I would have to pick as my number 4 pick A Storm of Swords by George R. R. Martin, book 3 in his Song of Ice and Fire series. If you haven't read it because you're worried about kind of like what this is going to look like, how the series will ever finish, if it will ever finish, I promise you, you will not regret reading this, no matter what. It doesn't matter if he doesn't write another word in that series, it's worth a shot. So please, I implore you to check out that series. And that book, in my opinion, is my favorite and the one that really made me cement my love for A Song of Ice and Fire. In 2020, I also started reading, I told you I'd read Mistborn, and I wanted to read more of Brandon Sanderson's work. So I said, okay, I think I'm going to try Stormlight Archive. And, I know that's his magnum opus of a series, and I read The Way of Kings, and I thought it was just an absolutely riveting book. It was a little slow at parts, honestly, and there was a lot of terminology. I was earlier on in my fantasy, reading career, or whatever you want to call it, and reading experience. And, so it was a lot to take in, but I absolutely loved it from start to finish. I still think it's one of the pillars of fantasy, of modern fantasy. But if I had to choose one book from the series, because again, all S tier books. I would say probably the first three are S tier for me, then Rhythm of War was maybe A tier or something. But if I had to choose one book from this list, it would be number 2, Words of Radiance. There's something about book 2s, it could either make or break the series for me. And Words of Radiance is just a better book than A Way of Kings. I mean, The Way of Kings is a mind-blowing book, but Words of Radiance takes it to another level. The way Kaladin's story starts to really develop. Shallan's story was so fascinating in this, and kind of like the ways Brandon Sanderson deals with trauma and deals with depression and deals with like these very human emotions, grounded emotions, things that we all face, and puts them in this fantasy world is a sight to behold. Not only that, like the grandiose, epic kind of saga and the world building and the magic system. And you see the magic system evolve from book to book. I really think Words of Radiance is his best paced book of the 4. And I really think his character development is his most compelling of the 4 books. I really am excited for Wind and Truth, and I hope that one will topple this off the list. But right now, Words of Radiance, book 2, is my favorite of the Stormlight Archive, and that is my solid number 3 choice. Before we get to these last 2, I just want to say, if you like this kind of a list, please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what your top 10 would be. I would love to kind of create a dialogue, because that's my favorite kind of thing about BookTube and this book community, is to be able to chat with you all about the books that mean so much to us. And I love to hear where we overlap, where we disagree, and I just love having conversations with you all. So I really appreciate you being on this journey so far, and now down to the top 2 picks. So the second pick, number 2, is... So, as you know, Stephen King is my favorite author of all time. If you've been watching this channel or following this channel, you know that I talk about Stephen King in practically every video. And this video is no exception. I have a whole shelf dedicated to the man back here. And of course, he is known for his horror. He's been known in his 90s for kind of his more family drama-oriented kind of books and things like that. But he also wrote the fantasy series, The Dark Tower. And The Dark Tower had such an indelible impression on my life. I remember in 2016, I started reading the books. And I read The Gunslinger, the first book, and I wasn't quite sure. I kind of found it a little boring, to be honest. Which is ironic, because it's the shortest book by a mile in that series. And I was like, do I really want to continue? So then I'm like, okay, I'll just try the second book. And I open up the first chapter. And something happens in that. The whole idea of like plot armor and things like that. This is the opposite of plot armor. This is like anti-armor or something. And something happens in that book that really just kept me hooked. And then the book started to open up to this wider world of the Dark Tower universe, the path of the beam at which all the characters are on. And it literally, I felt my mind was expanding while I was reading it. It's like, almost like you feel like you're hallucinating when you're reading the series, or you're being given the keys to the universe. All of the universe's secrets can be answered by following Rowan's singular and kind of solo path down the path of the beam to the Dark Tower. Now, the book I'm going to choose of the 7 that came out, the 7 main ones, because I don't really count the side quest story, Wind Through the Keyhole, as anything really worth checking out. But if I had to choose one book that was exceptionally mind-blowing, it would be book 3, The Wastelands. Now, the ability of Stephen King to make you care about every single character, the side characters, the people Roland meets along the way, is just exceptional in this. And the characters really start to evolve. It's the first time you see the quartet, the 4 main characters, all together in this novel. And it is such an acid trip through fantasy. It's such a mishmash. There are elements, not to spoil anything, but elements from our modern, kind of world. There are elements from the past. There are elements from Roland's world. It feels like a Western. It feels like a horror. It feels like a modern day kind of story. It is Arthurian almost in its scope. It's such a mishmash that you can't really pinpoint it to one particular genre, but it is fantasy through and through. And I felt like The Wastelands was the most mind-blowing, and I remember reading it, and I got to a particular point in the book, kind of in the latter half of it, and I don't want to spoil anything, but I really felt like if I follow the Roland's path, I will find the answers I'm looking for in my own life. Like, I was going through kind of a low point in my life at the time. I had a lot of questions about my place in the world and, what it all means and things like that. And I felt like this series really helped me answer some of those questions. I'm not even kidding. Like, I am not being hyperbolic in that statement. And, I think Roland's plight of being singularly focused on a particular objective and not necessarily knowing why really reflects, I think, our own existential questions about why we do what we do. And so I just found it riveting, and I had to put it in my number 2 spot because it is a sight to behold. If for any of you who read the first book and felt a little trepidatious about continuing, I say at least get to the third before you decide, because the second and third books are just mind blasting. They'll put you in another, they're timeless in my opinion. So that is my number 2 spot, and drum roll please, number 1. So this particular series is a long one. It's about 15 books. I started reading it back in 2019. This kind of epiphany that I wanted to pitch for a fantasy series because, as a composer, because I wanted to write more music in that vein. So I looked online and I tried to find the biggest fantasy series that's being developed. I found Amazon Studios was developing the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. So I'm like, maybe I should read the source material and write something in that style. I don't know, it just seemed like a cool experiment. So I started reading book 1. I thought it was really cool. It's classic fantasy, but it felt very kind of Tolkien influenced and things like that. Then I read The Great Hunt by Robert Jordan, book 2 in the Wheel of Time series. And to say that opened up my world is a vast understatement. I mean, he takes a hard left turn in that book and makes something that completely stands on its own. It is some of the most unique magic system, unique world building, confluence of different cultures that are reminiscent of our time, but then something that might take place far in the future. Rand's plight, the Tavern's destiny. I mean, it's all intermingled in this book, and you really start to see where the rest of the series is going to lead. And it has a third act that you could tell Brandon Sanderson is influenced by that. His whole Sanderlanche thing where the third act is just like mind-blowing, that was influenced from this. And I mean, the third act in this book, I remember feeling like my hands were shaking while I was reading it. It was that kind of a visceral feeling. Shortly after I finished that book, I decided to write a piece. I wrote a piece that was kind of a love letter to fantasy and a love letter to the Wheel of Time. That ended up being the piece that I shared around with fans, and it got, on tour.com, did a whole article on it, and Lorne Balfe ended up seeing it, and he hired me to help score the Wheel of Time series. So that really started my film and TV journey in terms of writing music for book adaptations. And this is the book that really started it all for me. And it really started my love of fantasy. After I read that book, then I found Daniel Green's YouTube channel. I found Mike's book reviews. I found, a bunch of other channels. And I started going, oh, who's Joe Abercrombie? Oh, who is, Jim Butcher? I wanted to read all these other series. And that kind of started my love of fantasy. So it started my love of fantasy. It got me my job now. And it just means the most to me, and it was the book that I really feel like the Wheel of Time reaches heights that are greater than that in terms of scope, but nothing quite reached the heights of what that made me feel like, if that makes sense. That particular book made me feel like, wow, this is what's possible in fantasy. I thought fantasy was only the traditional fantasy. I didn't know that fantasy could be something that is like timeless, that is modern, that feels like nothing else you've ever experienced. I'm like, oh, what else could be considered fantasy? Then I read like Jade City, and I was like, oh, that could be considered fantasy too. And it's like you start to see, oh, fantasy can mean so many things. So that book means the most to me, and the Wheel of Time series really means so much to me. And so I had to put The Great Hunt by Robert Jordan, book 2 of the Wheel of Time series, as my number 1 pick. So thank you so much for watching, and please like and subscribe. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. Let me know your top 10 in this, in the comment section. And again, I would love to have a dialogue with you all. That's my favorite part about this channel and about speaking to you all, is about to speak about the books that we love, the books that should get more attention. So with that, thank you so much for watching, and please be good to yourselves. Please be good to each other. I'll see you on the next video. Take care.